Hello, my name is Niamh Fahy. I am a research associate and visual artist working at the Centre for Fine Print Research here in UE. Thank you to Angie Butler and Damien Leach for inviting me to present today. So, I have a multidisciplinary practice but work predominantly with printmaking and photographic processes as well as some mixed media and digital embroidery. And today I will introduce my practice through presenting a body of work titled Immediately Intimate. So, my work is primarily concerned with the translation of landscape, and this project really began when I came across the work of Nan Shepherd, who wrote The Living Mountain in 1945. And this book describes Shepherd's relationship to the Cairngorm Mountains in Scotland, where she lived, worked, and mountaineered for many years. And for me, her words provided a source of understanding on how the physical landscape can move beyond the material into the metaphorical in our portrayal of it as artists and writers. So, interestingly, in 1945, the same year Shepherd wrote The Living Mountain, Merleau-Ponty published his work Phenomenology of Perception, where he argues that knowledge is felt, that our bodies think and know in ways that precede cognition. Shepherd would also explore notions of embodied cognition in her writing. Her descriptions of the Cairngorms express an acute level of sensitivity to both the physical and metaphysical experience of mountains. She was influenced by Tao and Buddhist philosophy, and unlike many of her male counterparts, she was more interested in what she called the deep recesses, the mountain's interior. So she meditated on going into the mountain rather than reaching the summit. Around the same time as reading this, I had been to Snowdonia to climb Cadair Idris and found my experience was closely aligned to Shepherd's, but it also evoked questions around what Shepherd might have referred to as the continual traffic between the outer landscape and the inner landscape of the spirit. As I walked, I gathered visual information, took photos, and collected words that came to mind, which would all later inform my initial visual references for my work. My experience initiated a lot of questions on how we describe our relationship to landscape, the authenticity of embodiment, and notions of landscape in this age of the Anthropocene, the age of distraction, interruptions from technology, busy minds, and issues around land ownership. However, I kept returning to this continuous sense of impermanence and a shifting of the senses. As I walked, the mountain seemed to be constantly revealing itself through touch, smell, sound, sight, or lack of. The higher you climb, fog could be blinding you, while the sound of roaring water is keeping you alert and awake. And just like that, your whole self is invested and enlivened by that sense of connecting you to the present. And back in the studio, I kept returning to how Shepherd had given agency to the Cairngorms, and a sense of reciprocal touch was deeply embedded in our work. So we are shaped by landscape as landscape is shaped by us. But she has imparted a space to consider life that's other than human, life that is layered and woven and contains many worlds within it. I think in this moment we desperately need to consider the forms of life we are entangled with and our relationship to them. And I suppose this work attempts to navigate that and considers the geological as well as the psychological experience of landscape. I've tried to express more than the material features of place, but I've really grappled with that communion of consciousness, body, and the natural world. And I think there is a gap between memory and experience that can cause tension. It can hide details or ignore histories. And I wanted to acknowledge and almost inhabit that gap within my work. For me, it seemed important to give my work an anchor in the physicality of my experience. So I worked with, initially I worked with images of the mountain's exterior, um, working in relief, lithography, laser cutting and etching. I implemented subtle disruptions within my images to try and indicate obscured memory or history. And I made simple interventions through veiling, distorting, extracting details from my prints. And I wanted to create this sense of the mountain growing or receding through time. So, landscape changes dramatically over time. It's part of this ever changing cycle that exists in deep time. And in 300,000 years, our native countries could have drifted to other continents. Scotland could be a desert island with the Cairngorms flat and arid. And it's difficult to imagine such great expanses of time. The mountain, like the mind, is in a constant state of flux that's not always apparent. Our minds select and frame memories. Details can become transformed, altered, and eventually replaced due to those currents of time. So this takes me to working with digital embroidery. And my initial reasons for working with this medium was to explore a way of connecting fragmented elements within my work. I wanted to build this layered narrative, and so I started drawing in stitch to map the landscape. I worked from digital photos and laser files, and my initial pieces were more dense and descriptive, working with bitmaps and complex images. But as the work evolved, details began to fall away, and I could extract only essential outlines and shapes. I simplified my designs and worked more immediately with the process. And so I created raised stitched on paper, and that enabled the work to exist both as fluid and taut. This method also created a gap that was important, and it functioned as this in-between space that allowed me to question that gap between memory and experience. So embroidery functioned as both a connective tissue in the work, but also the movement of the thread and the stillness of the image acknowledged these countervailing ideas, allowing them to coexist in the same piece. And these dichotomies, well, they seem to activate the work and create a stronger sense of rhythm and fluidity that's intrinsic in nature. So during this time, I also began to work with wet plate collodion. This process itself creates an interesting haptic. The results are evocative and painterly, but it's quite difficult to achieve. The process involves coating a glass or lacquered enamel plate with collodion solution. The plate is then placed in a silver bath to become light sensitive before it is put in a large format camera, exposed and then developed. The areas hit by light will show a metallic silver, but the exposure and processing must all be done while the plate is wet. I felt this form of photography allowed me to question the photograph's function as a mirror of reality. I quickly began to find connections between what I was making in print and stitch to the marks that were emerging in my tintypes and ambrotypes. These marks were often like cracks or fissures. They added more detail and also could could obscure or erase some of the information that had been in the composition. Simon Tarrant describes photography's ability to blur truth and fiction as one of its most compelling qualities, and I think Collodion demonstrates that very well. There's a sense of erosion and absence that can exist in the plate, as well as this animated and vivid quality of the image. And to me, it conveys an impossibility of landscape and of memory. Its imperfections are generous in asking you to look closer, and there's an intimacy in the image that seems to be continuously unfolding and appears in a state of becoming or maybe unbecoming. It can both conserve or erase time, and it seems to comment on that unreliability of memory, as if the image might be both emerging or disappearing. The image on the plate seems to take the form and reflect the essence of its subject, and it's generous. Again, it's generous in its poetry. To me, it offers an intimacy and an invitation to take a closer look. So in this body of work, I've attempted to map and weave my experience through many disciplines. Each piece has been created in response to the other. Each aspect is intended to complete the other. I created in order to unravel, and I built layers so that I could unpeel them, looking for this language that could hold work suspended between movement and stillness, resistance and surrender, and some sort of longing to reconnect what's fragmented. So to conclude the talk, I'm just going to take a moment to speak about the influence of Zen on my practice as well. So when we talk about meditation, we often hear a lot about being an observer of the body and the breath, but what we're actually doing is becoming body and breath with no separation, no observer. And in my practice, I want to go beyond that observer, that witnessing, to become an active participant with the world that I am inhabiting. We're often told that when we love something, we'll take really good care of it. But I also think the opposite is true. When you really start to look and take care of something, you fall in love with it. You can become intimate with nature, and when we can become intimate with nature and our relationship to it, we can transition from observer into something more deeply connected, something that shows us that we are part of everything. And in my practice, I'm trying to understand and linger on that transition of becoming. So thank you for listening.